$1,500. That's what Sister Beatrice Murphy found in an envelope taped to the front door of the Memphis Salvation Army headquarters at 6:47 a.m. on Christmas morning. The check was made out to the Salvation Army, signed with an illegible scroll, with only 2 words written in the memo line: "Merry Christmas." No return address, no note, just a cashier's check from Memphis First National Bank that could feed 40 hungry families for the entire winter. Sister Beatrice stood in the freezing December dawn, her breath forming clouds in the air, staring at this mysterious envelope like it might disappear if she blinked. At 62 years old, she'd been running the Memphis Salvation Army for 19 years, and in all that time she'd never seen anything quite like this. Anonymous donations happened, sure, but usually they were $5 slipped into the collection plate, maybe 20 if someone was feeling particularly generous. But $1,500, that was more than the Salvation Army's entire Christmas budget for the year. Her hands were shaking, and not just from the cold, as she unlocked the door and stepped inside the headquarters. The building smelled like coffee and old hymnals, familiar and comforting. But nothing felt comfortable about this check burning a hole in her coat pocket, because Sister Beatrice had been doing this work long enough to know that when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. She walked through the quiet building, past the rows of donated coats and toys waiting to be distributed, past the industrial kitchen where volunteers would soon be preparing Christmas dinners, and into her small office at the back. The walls were covered with thank you cards from families they'd helped over the years, faded photographs of Christmas celebrations, and a calendar marked with distribution schedules and volunteer shifts. This was her life's work, helping Memphis families who'd fallen on hard times, and this mysterious check represented more help than she'd been able to provide in the last 6 months combined. She picked up the phone and dialed Reverend James Crawford at the First Baptist Church on Beale Street. If anyone in Memphis would know about a wealthy benefactor making Christmas donations, it would be Reverend Crawford. He'd been ministering in Memphis since before Elvis Presley was born, and he knew everyone who had money in this city. The phone rang 4 times before Crawford's gravelly voice answered. "Sister Beatrice, do you have any idea what time it is?" "It's Christmas morning, James, and I need your help." Sister Beatrice's voice was tight with a mixture of hope and anxiety. "Someone left a $1,500 check on our door. Cashier's check, Memphis First National. Signature I can't read. You know anybody who'd do something like this?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Beatrice," he said slowly, "I just found a check for $1,000 on my church steps. Same bank, same illegible signature. I was about to call you." Sister Beatrice felt her stomach drop. 2 checks. Same morning. Same mysterious donor. What in God's name is happening here? What happened next would take both of them the better part of an hour to discover, making phone calls to every church, charity and non-profit organization they knew in Memphis. And what they found left them both speechless. 53 organizations, 53 envelope checks ranging from $500 to $2,000. Totaling just over $100,000, all from Memphis First National Bank, all with the same illegible signature, all delivered sometime between midnight and dawn on Christmas morning. At the Goodwill Community Center on Poplar Avenue, Director Thomas Washington had found his envelope at 7:50. He'd been the first to arrive at work, unlocking the center's front doors to prepare for the day's Christmas dinner service. The envelope had been wedged between the door and the frame, as if someone had carefully placed it there to ensure it wouldn't blow away in the winter wind. Inside was a check for $1,800 and a small note written in that same illegible hand. "For the families who need hope this Christmas." Thomas had stared at that note for a full 5 minutes before his hands stopped shaking enough to pick up the phone. He'd called his wife first, then his board of directors, then every charity contact he had. And that's when he started hearing the same story repeated across Memphis. The YMCA had received $1,200. St. Jude Children's Research Hospital had received $2,000. The tiny Riverside Baptist Church food pantry, which operated out of a converted garage and served maybe 30 families a month, had received $500. Even the Memphis Jewish Community Center, which primarily served the Jewish community in Midtown, had found an envelope containing $1,000 and a note that said simply, "Lush." By 8:30 that morning, Sister Beatrice's office at the Salvation Army headquarters looked like a war room. 16 charity directors crowded into the small space, all of them holding their mysterious checks, all of them asking the same question. Is this real? We need to get to the bank, said Thomas Washington, director of the Goodwill Community Center. We need to verify these checks before we make any promises to families. The bank opens at 9. We've got 30 minutes. But it's Christmas Day, said elderly Father Patrick O'Brien from the Catholic Youth Services. The bank won't be open. Memphis First National has a Christmas morning emergency line, Sister Beatrice said, already dialing for exactly this kind of situation. The bank manager, a man named Richard Coleman, who sounded deeply annoyed at being called on Christmas morning, initially refused to verify the checks over the phone. Bank policy, ma'am. I can't give out information about client accounts. Mr. Coleman, Sister Beatrice said, her voice carrying the authority of nearly 2 decades of non-profit work. I have 16 charity directors in my office right now, all holding cashier's checks from your bank, totaling over $100,000. We have distribution trucks loaded with Christmas dinners and presents for 400 families scheduled to leave in 3 hours. If these checks are fraudulent, we need to know now. So I suggest you make an exception to your bank policy. There was a long pause. Then Coleman said, "Give me the check numbers." It took him 12 minutes to verify all 16 checks they'd brought to Sister Beatrice's office. Every single one cleared. Every single one legitimate. Every single one backed by actual funds deposited into Memphis First National. They're real, Coleman confirmed. And Sister Beatrice heard something in his voice she couldn't quite identify. Shock, maybe, or recognition. But before she could ask, he added, "I need to go," and hung up. The room erupted. Some directors were crying. Others were laughing. Thomas Washington kept saying, $100,000, $100,000, like he couldn't quite make himself believe it. Father O'Brien simply bowed his head and started praying. But Sister Beatrice wasn't celebrating yet, because one question still burned in her mind and it wouldn't let her rest. WHO is doing this. Among the families who would benefit from these mysterious checks was the Rodriguez family, living in a cramped apartment in South Memphis. Maria Rodriguez was a 34-year-old widow raising 3 children on a seamstress's salary. Her husband had died in a construction accident 18 months earlier, and since then Maria had been working 16-hour days just to keep food on the table. There would be no Christmas presents this year. There might not even be Christmas dinner. But Maria hadn't told her children yet. She kept hoping for a miracle, even though she'd long ago stopped believing in miracles. At 9:30 that Christmas morning, there was a knock on Maria's door. It was Thomas Washington from the Goodwill Community Center, where Maria had registered for assistance 2 weeks earlier. He was carrying 3 boxes wrapped in bright paper and wearing the biggest smile Maria had ever seen. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, "Merry Christmas. We've had an unexpected donation, and we wanted to make sure your family was taken care of." Maria started crying before he even finished speaking. The boxes contained a complete Christmas dinner, enough to feed her family for a week. There were presents for each of her children, carefully selected based on the ages and interests she'd listed on her application. And there was an envelope containing a grocery store gift card for $200. "Who did this?" Maria asked through her tears. "Who would do this for us?" Thomas Washington smiled. "Someone who remembers what it's like to need help. Someone who wants to make sure your children have a real Christmas." But Maria wouldn't learn until years later that the mysterious benefactor had once been a boy just like her own son, watching his mother cry because she couldn't provide a Christmas for her child. She wouldn't know that the man who'd made this miracle possible had never forgotten that shame, that helplessness, that desperate wish to make his mother smile again. Back at the Salvation Army, Sister Beatrice was making her way to the Memphis Press Scimitar newspaper office on Union Avenue, where her nephew Danny worked as a reporter. If anyone could help her track down this mysterious benefactor, it would be Dan. He had connections all over Memphis, sources in places Sister Beatrice didn't even know existed. Danny Murphy was 31 years old, ambitious, and perpetually caffeinated. When his aunt burst into the newsroom on Christmas morning, he was already there, chasing down a story about a warehouse fire on the riverfront. But when Sister Beatrice told him about the checks, he forgot all about the fire. 100 grand, he said slowly, pulling out his notebook. All delivered anonymously, all the same bank. Aunt B. This is the biggest story to hit Memphis since Martin Luther King came to town. They spent the next hour making calls, pulling records, talking to anyone who might know something. And slowly, carefully, Danny started to put the pieces together. Memphis First National Bank had indeed processed 53 cashier's checks on Christmas Eve, all purchased in cash by a single individual, a man who had walked into the bank at exactly 4:47 p.m., with a list of charities and a brown paper bag containing $105,000 in cash. Did anyone see his face? Sister Beatrice demanded. The teller who processed the transaction was a 23-year-old woman named Carol Henderson. Danny tracked her down at her parents' house on Christmas morning. Yes, she'd seen him. No, she couldn't give them his name due to bank confidentiality, but she could tell them this. He was wearing sunglasses indoors, a scarf covering most of his face, and a hat pulled low, and when he'd handed her the list of charities, his hands were shaking. He was nervous. Carol told them, sitting in her parents' living room, with a cup of coffee warming her hands, like he was afraid someone would recognize him. But his voice was kind. He kept saying, "Make sure they get it on Christmas morning. It has to be Christmas morning." And when I told him it would take time to process all 53 checks, he said he'd wait. He sat in the bank lobby for nearly 2 hours while I prepared everything, just sitting there, reading a magazine, looking like any other customer except for the sunglasses and scarf. Did he say anything else? Danny pressed. Anything that might help us identify him? Carol thought for a moment. He hummed. While he was waiting, he was humming Christmas carols. Silent Night, I think, and Blue Christmas. His voice was really good, actually. I remember thinking he should be a singer. Sister Beatrice and Danny exchanged glances. Blue Christmas, that was an Elvis Presley song, but surely that was just a coincidence, wasn't it? They spent the rest of Christmas afternoon tracking down every person who might have information. The security guard at Memphis First National who'd been on duty Christmas Eve said the man had arrived in a black Cadillac with tinted windows. The parking lot attendant at the bank remembered the car but not the driver. A street vendor, selling newspapers on the corner, said he'd seen someone matching that description but thought nothing of it because, well, this was Memphis. Lots of people wore sunglasses. But there was one more witness Danny managed to track down. A janitor named Earl Johnson, who'd been cleaning the bank that Christmas Eve. Earl remembered the man in sunglasses because he'd been so polite, holding doors open, saying thank you and excuse me every time he passed by. And Earl remembered something else, something that made Sister Beatrice's heart start racing. He had this ring, Earl said, big gold ring with some kind of lightning bolt design on it. I noticed it because it caught the light when he was writing out all those checks. And he had these gold bracelets, 2, 3, or 4 of them on each wrist. Flashy jewelry, you know, like something an entertainer would wear. TCB, Danny said suddenly. Taking care of business, that's Elvis Presley's motto, and his jewelry always has that lightning bolt design. Sister Beatrice felt like the pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. But she still couldn't quite see the complete picture. Elvis Presley, the biggest star in the world, sneaking around Memphis on Christmas Eve to deliver anonymous checks to charities. It seemed impossible. And yet, the more she thought about it, the more sense it made. By evening, they'd hit what seemed like a dead end. The mysterious benefactor had covered his tracks too well. No clear identification, no witnesses who could definitively say it was Elvis. Just $105,000 distributed among 53 charities, touching the lives of hundreds of families who would wake up on Christmas morning to miracles they never expected. But Sister Beatrice couldn't let it go, because this wasn't just about the money. This was about understanding what kind of person would do something like this. What kind of heart beats in someone who gives away a fortune and refuses to take credit. It was Father O'Brien who finally offered a theory that made sense. "I've been thinking about this all day," he said when he called Sister Beatrice that night. His voice was thoughtful, measured, the way it got when he was working through a theological problem. "And I think I know what kind of person does this. Someone who remembers what it's like to have nothing. Someone who knows what it means to be hungry on Christmas. Someone who wants to give back but doesn't want the attention because attention would make the gift about them instead of about the people receiving it." Sister Beatrice thought about that for a long time. Then she said, You're talking about someone who grew up poor. I'm talking about someone who grew up right here in Memphis, Father O'Brien said quietly, or close to it. Someone who might have once been on the receiving end of charity. Someone who never forgot what that felt like. And who wants to make sure other people don't have to feel that shame. The next morning, Sister Beatrice did something she'd been avoiding. She drove to Tupelo, Mississippi, 2 hours south of Memphis, to visit her old friend Margaret Sullivan. Margaret had worked for the Salvation Army back in the 40s and 50s, during the war years and the difficult times that followed. If anyone knew about families who'd needed help back then, families who might have grown up to become wealthy enough to give back in such a dramatic way, it would be Margaret. Margaret was 81 years old, living in a small house near the Tupelo fairground. She invited Sister Beatrice in, served her coffee and cornbread, and listened to the whole story. When Sister Beatrice finished, Margaret was quiet for a long time, staring into her coffee cup like she was looking at something very far away. Then she said, "I remember a family back in 1945, 1946. Young boy, maybe 10, 11 years old. His mother worked in a laundry, barely making ends meet. Father was around sometimes, but not reliable. They lived in a shotgun shack on Old Saltillo Road, one of those places that should have been condemned. I remember because the boy came to the Salvation Army on Christmas morning, 1945, asking if we had any food." "What happened?" Sister Beatrice asked, leaning forward in her chair. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "We gave them what we could. Wasn't much. A ham, some vegetables, a few canned goods, a couple of toys for the boy that someone had donated. But I remember his mother crying. She kept saying, 'This is the first real Christmas my son's ever had.' And the boy, he just stood there looking at that ham like it was made of gold, like it was the most precious thing he'd ever seen. He didn't say much, but I remember his eyes, big blue eyes, so full of shame and gratitude, all mixed together." "Do you remember their names?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Vernon and Gladys, and their son's name was Elvis. Elvis Aaron Presley, with one A in Aaron, not two. I remember because it was such an unusual name. You didn't forget a name like Elvis." Sister Beatrice felt something click into place, like a key turning in a lock she didn't even know existed. Elvis Presley, the biggest star in the world. The boy from Tupelo who'd grown up to become the king of rock and roll. Could it really be him? "Did you ever see them again?" Sister Beatrice asked. Margaret shook her head. "They moved to Memphis not long after that Christmas. I heard years later that the boy had become famous, but I never put it together. Never thought that the little boy with the big blue eyes and the shabby clothes would turn into Elvis Presley. But now that you tell me this story, now it all makes sense. That boy never forgot what it felt like to have nothing. And he never forgot that someone helped him when he needed it most." Sister Beatrice drove back to Memphis that afternoon with her mind racing. She went straight to Danny's apartment, not even stopping to change out of her church clothes. "We need to look into Elvis Presley," she told him. Danny laughed. "Aunt B, Elvis Presley didn't sneak around Memphis, handing out checks on Christmas Eve. He's the most famous man in America. Someone would have recognized him. He can't even buy groceries without causing a riot. Not if he didn't want to be recognized," Sister Beatrice insisted. "Not if he was very, very careful. Think about it, Danny. The timing fits. The location fits. The jewelry description fits. And the motivation fits. Elvis Presley grew up dirt poor in Tupelo. His family received charity from the Salvation Army on Christmas 1945. What if he's been paying that forward ever since? He had the money to do it. So they dug deeper. They pulled records from the Memphis tax assessor's office and discovered that every year since 1962, a series of large charitable donations had been made to Memphis nonprofits around Christmas time. The amounts varied, but they always totaled somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000. And they were always anonymous. Then Danny made a call to his friend who worked at Memphis First National, someone who owed him a favor and was willing to bend the confidentiality rules just a little bit. And what that friend told him changed everything. "The account the checks came from," Danny's source said quietly, speaking so softly that Danny had to press the phone hard against his ear to hear him, has been making these donations every Christmas for 7 years. Same account. Same pattern, always exactly on Christmas Eve, always in cash, always anonymous. And I can't tell you whose account it is, but I can tell you this. The account holder has a Memphis address on Elvis Presley Boulevard, and the account has enough money in it to keep making these donations for the next 100 years. Sister Beatrice felt tears spring to her eyes when Danny told her. It was him. It had always been him. For 7 years, Elvis Presley had been secretly distributing his fortune to Memphis Charities, making sure that families who were struggling, families like his own family had once been, would have Christmas miracles. But why keep it secret? Danny asked, genuinely confused. Why not take credit? The publicity would be incredible. He could inspire other wealthy people to give. He could probably double or triple his impact if people knew it was him. Sister Beatrice thought about the young boy standing in the Tupelo Salvation Army, staring at a ham like it was made of gold. She thought about the shame that comes with poverty, the humiliation of needing charity, the way it marks you even after you've escaped it. She thought about her own childhood, growing up in a family that sometimes struggled to make ends meet, and how she'd felt when neighbors brought food or the church paid their heating bill. Grateful, yes, but also ashamed, also less than, also like a failure, because he doesn't want people to give because Elvis Presley told them to, she said quietly. He wants them to give because it's the right thing to do, and he doesn't want the families receiving the help to feel like they're accepting charity from a celebrity. He wants them to feel like they're being cared for by their community. He wants to preserve their dignity. Danny wanted to publish the story. This is news, Aunt B. This is huge news. People deserve to know. This could change how people think about charity, about wealth, about giving back. But Sister Beatrice refused to let him. If Elvis wanted his identity known, he'd have put his name on those checks. We need to respect his wishes, and more than that, we need to protect the families receiving help. The moment this becomes about Elvis Presley's generosity, it stops being about community care and starts being about celebrity charity. That's not what he wants. I can feel it. So they kept the secret. Sister Beatrice, Danny Father O'Brien, Thomas Washington, and the handful of others who'd figured it out. They never told the newspapers. They never told the families receiving the help. They simply accepted the miracle for what it was, an act of pure, selfless generosity from someone who remembered what it meant to have nothing. But the story doesn't end there, because on January 7, 1969, Sister Beatrice received a phone call that changed everything. It was from Graceland, Elvis Presley's estate on Highway 51 South. A polite voice on the other end said, Mr. Presley would like to invite you to lunch tomorrow at 2 o'clock. He'd like to discuss expanding his charitable work in Memphis. A car will pick you up at 1:30. Sister Beatrice barely slept that night. She kept replaying everything in her mind, wondering what Elvis would say, wondering if she'd done the right thing by keeping his secret. She chose her best dress, a simple navy blue one that she wore to important meetings, and waited by her window for the car to arrive. At exactly 1:30 p.m., a black Cadillac pulled up in front of her house. The driver, a pleasant middle-aged man who introduced himself as Charlie, opened the door for her and made small talk about the weather as they drove through Memphis toward Graceland. As they approached the famous music note gates, Sister Beatrice felt her heart pounding. She'd lived in Memphis her whole life, but she'd never been inside Graceland. Few people had. The mansion was exactly as grand as she'd imagined, with its tall white columns and perfectly manicured lawn. But what struck her most as she walked through the front door was how much it felt like a home. Yes, there were gold records on the walls and expensive furniture in every room, but there were also family photos, books left open on tables, and the smell of cooking coming from somewhere in the back of the house. Elvis was waiting in a sitting room off the main hallway, wearing a simple black shirt and looking far more nervous than any superstar should ever look. He stood when she entered, and she was struck by how tall he was, how his presence seemed to fill the room even though he was being quiet and still. Sister Murphy, he said, shaking her hand with both of his. His grip was warm, strong, and she could feel him trembling slightly. I understand you've been asking questions about the Christmas checks. Sister Beatrice felt her face flush. Mr. Presley, I want you to know that your secret is safe. We won't tell anyone. I came here today because I wanted to thank you personally for what you've done for families like Maria Rodriguez and hundreds of others who needed help." Elvis smiled, but it was a sad smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ma'am, I didn't ask you here because I'm worried about publicity. I asked you here because I want to tell you something I've never told anyone outside my family, something I need you to understand." He gestured for her to sit on a plush sofa, then settled into a chair across from her. "When I was 10 years old," he began, his voice soft and careful, like he was handling something fragile. "My mama and I had nothing, and I mean nothing. Daddy was around sometimes, but he was in and out of trouble, couldn't keep a job. Mama was working herself to death in a laundry, coming home so tired she could barely stand, and we were living in a 2-room shack in Tupelo that had holes in the walls and no heat. I used to stuff newspaper in the cracks to try to keep the cold out." He paused, his eyes fixed on something far away, seeing a past that Sister Beatrice could only imagine. "Christmas 1945. I was 10 years old, and I understood enough to know that we didn't have money for presents or food or any kind of celebration. Mama tried to hide it from me, but I'd see her crying when she thought I was asleep. And on Christmas morning we woke up with nothing. No food in the house, no presents under the tree because we didn't even have a tree, just another cold, empty day in that shack." "What happened?" Sister Beatrice asked gently, even though she already knew part of the story from Margaret. Elvis's voice grew thick with emotion. "Mama started crying, really crying. Not the quiet tears she usually tried to hide. She kept apologizing to me, saying she was sorry. She was so sorry she couldn't give me a Christmas. And I remember feeling this terrible, terrible shame. Not because we were poor, because I knew lots of kids who were poor, but because my mama was hurting, and I couldn't do anything to help her. I felt like I'd failed her somehow, like if I was a better son, maybe things would be different." A tear rolled down his cheek, and he wiped it away impatiently. "So we went to the Salvation Army in Tupelo, walked there in the cold because we didn't have a car. And there was this woman there, older lady with kind eyes and gray hair. Margaret, I think her name was. She gave us a box with a ham and some vegetables and a couple of toys. Not expensive toys, just simple things. A wooden truck, I remember. And my mama, she just broke down. She kept thanking this woman, over and over. And the woman, she didn't make us feel small. She didn't make us feel like we were begging. She treated us like we mattered, like we were important." Sister Beatrice pulled a tissue from her purse and offered it to Elvis, but he shook his head, letting the tears fall. "That was Margaret Sullivan," she said softly. "She still remembers you. She told me about the boy with the big blue eyes who looked at a Christmas ham like it was made of gold." Elvis let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "That ham was gold, Sister Murphy. That ham meant everything. It meant we weren't alone. It meant someone cared. It meant Christmas was still possible, even when everything else felt impossible. And more than that, it meant that my mama didn't have to cry anymore that day. I got to see her smile. I got to see her feel like maybe she hadn't failed me after all." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the vast Graceland estate with its trees and fountain and iron gate. "When I started making money, really making money, I kept thinking about that Christmas, about how one act of kindness changed everything for me and my mama, about how that woman at the Salvation Army didn't just give us food and toys, she gave us dignity, she gave us hope. And I thought, if I can do that for other families, if I can give them what that woman gave us, then maybe all this success means something more than just records and movies and fame. Why keep it secret?" Sister Beatrice asked. "Why not let people know? You could inspire millions of people to give." Elvis turned to face her, and she saw something raw and honest in his eyes. Because when you're on the receiving end of charity, especially when you're a child, there's a part of you that feels ashamed, like you're not good enough, like you've failed somehow, like you're less than other people. And I never want a family to feel like they're accepting Elvis Presley's charity. I don't want them to feel like they're objects of my pity or like they owe me gratitude, because I'm famous and they're not." He walked back to his chair and sat down, leaning forward with his hands clasped between his knees. I want them to feel like their community is taking care of them, like they matter because they're human beings, not because some singer felt sorry for them. The moment my name gets attached to those checks, it becomes about me. It becomes about Elvis Presley being generous. And that ruins it. That makes it about my ego instead of about their dignity. Sister Beatrice understood then, completely, and the anonymity wasn't about humility, though Elvis certainly had that. And it wasn't about avoiding publicity, though he was clearly uncomfortable with the idea of credit. It was about preserving the dignity of the families receiving help, making sure they never felt like objects of celebrity charity. It was about remembering what it felt like to be that 10-year-old boy, ashamed and grateful all at once, and making sure no other child had to feel that way. "Miss Presley," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "what you've done these past 7 years has changed hundreds of lives. You've fed families, provided Christmas presents for children, kept charities running when they would have had to close their door, and you've done it all without ever asking for recognition or gratitude. That's the most Christ-like thing I've ever witnessed." Elvis shook his head firmly. "I don't want recognition, Sister Murphy. I want to do more. That's why I asked you here. I want to expand this program. I want to set up a system where Memphis Charities can get reliable support year-round, not just at Christmas. I want to make sure that when families fall on hard times, there's always help available. But I need your help to do it right. I need your expertise. I need your guide." They spent the next 3 hours discussing Elvis's vision. He wanted to establish a foundation that would provide ongoing support to Memphis nonprofits, not flashy donations that would make headlines, but steady, reliable funding that would allow organizations to plan long-term, to expand their services, to hire more staff, to really make a difference in people's lives. And he wanted to do it all anonymously. The foundation would be real, legally established, properly funded, but Elvis's name would never appear on any public document. The funds would come from a series of trusts and intermediaries, so complex that no one outside a handful of lawyers and accountants would ever be able to trace them back to him. "I've already talked to my business manager," Elvis explained. "We can set up the Memphis Community Charitable Trust with an initial $500,000, and I'll continue to fund it every year. My manager thinks I'm crazy, but I don't care. This is important. This matters more than anything else I'll ever do." Sister Beatrice left Graceland that afternoon, with a renewed sense of purpose and a thick folder full of documents to review. She spent the next 6 months working with Elvis's lawyers and accountants, setting up the Memphis Community Charitable Trust. The trust was funded with that initial $500,000 donation, with promises of ongoing support for years to come. And true to his word, Elvis never sought credit. The trust operated quietly, distributing funds to dozens of Memphis charities over the following months and years. Sister Beatrice became the trust's primary administrator, reviewing applications, visiting organizations, making sure the money went where it could do the most good. In March of 1969, Maria Rodriguez's daughter Sophia started taking piano lessons, paid for by a scholarship from the Memphis Community Charitable Trust. Maria never knew that the scholarship came from Elvis Presley's foundation. She only knew that someone somewhere believed her daughter was worth investing in. In June of that same year, the Riverside Baptist Church food pantry expanded from serving 30 families a month to serving 200, thanks to a grant from the pantry's director, a 67-year-old retired teacher named Dorothy Mae Johnson, had no idea that Elvis Presley was funding her expansion. She only knew that someone understood how important her work was. By 1970, the Memphis Community Charitable Trust had distributed over $2 million to Memphis nonprofits. Libraries received funding for children's programs. Community centers got new equipment. Food banks expanded their services. After-school programs hired more teachers. And through it all, Elvis Presley remained anonymous, just another donor in a complex web of trusts and foundations. But even after Elvis's death in 1977, the trust continued, managed by his estate and carrying on his legacy of anonymous generosity. Sister Beatrice stayed on as administrator until her retirement in 1983. And by then, the trust had helped thousands of Memphis families. There's one more piece to this story. One final twist that Sister Beatrice didn't discover until years later. In 1985, she was going through some old Salvation Army records, preparing them for archival storage, when she found a letter dated December 24, 1968. The envelope was addressed to Sister Beatrice Murphy, but it had never been opened, somehow lost in the Christmas chaos of that year, and then misfiled in a box of old financial records. Her hands shook as she opened it, carefully peeling back the aged paper. Inside was a handwritten note. The handwriting was shaky, as if the writer had been emotional while writing it. And it said, "Thank you for helping my family when we had nothing. I was that 10-year-old boy with the Christmas ham. You changed my life. Now I want to change lives the way you changed mine. I want every child in Memphis to know that someone cares, that miracles are possible, that Christmas can still happen even when everything seems dark. This is my promise to you and to God. As long as I have breath in my body and money in my account, no Memphis family will go without help at Christmas. Merry Christmas." And it was signed with just 2 initials, EP. Sister Beatrice sat in the dusty archive room, holding that letter, and she wept because she understood finally, completely, what Elvis Presley's generosity had always been about. It wasn't about the money, though the money mattered. It wasn't about the recognition, which he actively avoided. It was about remembering, about never forgetting what it felt like to be that scared, ashamed 10-year-old boy watching his mother cry because she couldn't provide Christmas for her son. It was about making sure that no other child would have to watch their parent cry that way. It was about turning pain into purpose. The mystery of the Christmas checks was never reported in the newspapers during Elvis's lifetime. The story of his anonymous charity work never made headlines while he was alive. But in Memphis, among the people who ran the charities and served the families who needed help, the story was told quietly, reverently, like a sacred secret passed from one generation to the next. And every Christmas morning, when charity directors across Memphis found unexpected support, when families received help they desperately needed, when miracles happened in the lives of people who had given up hoping for miracles, someone would always whisper, "Maybe it's him. Maybe the King is watching over us." Because that's what real generosity looks like. Not the kind that seeks applause or recognition or tax deductions, but the kind that operates in silence, that preserves dignity, that changes lives without ever asking for thanks. The kind of generosity that comes from remembering what it was like to have nothing, and making sure no one else has to remember that feeling alone. Elvis Presley gave away millions during his lifetime, some of it publicly, through benefit concerts and celebrity charity events that raised money for causes he believed in, but most of it quietly, anonymously, through systems designed to help people without making them feel like they were accepting charity from the king of rock and roll. The Christmas morning of 1968, when 53 Memphis charities found mysterious envelopes containing over $100,000, was just one chapter in a much longer story of quiet generosity that spanned Elvis's entire adult life. From 1962 until his death in 1977, Elvis maintained this tradition, distributing between $75,000 and $150,000 every Christmas season to Memphis nonprofit. Sister Beatrice Murphy never told anyone outside her small circle about her lunch with Elvis at Graceland. She kept his secret faithfully until her death in 1992 at the age of 86. But before she died, she made arrangements for that letter from December 1968 to be preserved in the Memphis Salvation Army archives, with instructions that it should be opened and shared publicly only after enough time had passed that Elvis's wishes for anonymity during his lifetime would be respected. But his legacy of generosity could inspire future generations. Today, that letter is on display at Graceland, in a small exhibit dedicated to Elvis's charitable work. Thousands of people see it every year. They read those simple, powerful words, "Thank you for helping my family when we had nothing." And many of them understand something profound about what it means to be truly generous. Maria Rodriguez's daughter Sophia did become a concert pianist, performing with symphony orchestras across the United States. She never knew that her scholarship came from Elvis Presley's foundation, but she always credited the mysterious anonymous donor who believed in her when no one else did. In interviews later in life, she would say, Someone gave me a chance when my family had nothing. That gift changed everything. It taught me that talent isn't enough. You need someone to believe in you. And now I try to be that person for other young musicians. Dorothy Mae Johnson's food pantry at Riverside Baptist Church continued operating for 37 years, serving over 15,000 families before Dorothy retired at age 94. She died 6 months later, never knowing that Elvis Presley had funded her expansion. But she knew something more important, that generosity creates ripples that spread far beyond the original gift. The Memphis Community Charitable Trust, established by Elvis in 1969, is still operating today. Since its founding, it has distributed over $40 million to Memphis nonprofits. The trust's current administrators know about Elvis's role in its creation, but they continue to honor his wish for anonymity in their day-to-day operation. Grant recipients receive funds from the Memphis Community Charitable Trust, with no mention of Elvis Presley's name. But there's one final piece of this story that brings everything full circle. In 1995, 28 years after Elvis established his anonymous charitable trust, a young girl named Emma walked into the Memphis Salvation Army on Christmas morning with her single mother. They were homeless, living in their car, and hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days. The girl was 9 years old, the same age Elvis had been when his family was struggling in Tupelo. The Salvation Army director that year was a woman named Patricia Chen, who had learned the story of the Christmas checks from Sister Beatrice before her death. Patricia gave Emma and her mother food, clothing, and helped them find temporary housing. And as she watched Emma's face light up at the simple gift of a warm meal and a safe place to sleep, Patricia thought about that 10-year-old boy from Tupelo, who had turned his pain into purpose. 25 years later, in 2020, Emma became the director of the Memphis Community Charitable Trust. She'd worked her way through college and graduate school, always remembering the kindness shown to her and her mother on that Christmas morning. And when she discovered the Trust's connection to Elvis Presley, when she learned the full story of the Christmas checks and the boy with the ham, she wept. Because she understood. She understood what it meant to be saved by anonymous generosity. She understood the dignity preserved when help comes without the burden of celebrity recognition. And she understood that the greatest gift Elvis Presley ever gave wasn't his music or his movies or his fame. It was his memory, his refusal to forget where he came from, and his determination to make sure others wouldn't suffer the way he had suffered. Today, the Christmas tradition continued. Every December, the Memphis Community Charitable Trust distributes funds to Memphis nonprofits, just as it has every year since 1969. The amounts have grown with inflation, but the spirit remains the same. Help families, preserve dignity, remember what it was like to have nothing. And every Christmas morning, somewhere in Memphis, a family wakes up to find unexpected help. A charity discovers that their bills have been paid. A child receives a present they never expected. A miracle happens for someone who had stopped believing in miracle. And somewhere, maybe, the spirit of a boy from Tupelo, who never forgot his mother's tears and never stopped trying to make sure other mothers wouldn't have to cry that way, looks down and smiles. Because that's what real generosity looks like. That's what it means to turn pain into purpose, shame into strength, memory into action. That's what it means to be wealthy, not in money but in heart. And that's the true story of Elvis Presley. A story that has nothing to do with music or fame or legend, and everything to do with a 10-year-old boy who stared at a Christmas ham like it was made of gold, and promised himself that one day, somehow he would make sure no other child would have to feel that way. The Christmas checks of 1968 were just one expression of that promise.